Hi everyone, I'm Matthew Jackman. I'm from Melbourne, Australia, and I'm a lived experience activist and academic in global mental health. And I'll unpack a bit about what that means later on today in the talk. Currently, I am the Deputy Representative for the Western Pacific region on the Global Mental Health Peer Network. And I am part of the Global Shapers in the Melbourne hub with the World Economic Forum, which is a youth-led initiative from WEF around young leaders who do local work that has global impact. I'm also the Global Lived Experience Ambassador for Generation Mental Health, and I currently lecture within social work from a lived experience and service user perspective, founded on sort of critical sociology and other lived experience foundations within the Bachelor of Social Work program. I'm really excited to join you today as I'm really hoping to introduce you to some new concepts to think about your own lived experience and engage with your own story, but also to introduce to you the consumer or survivor MAD movement founded on civil rights, and how that's emerged into a movement in academia, but also in activism. So I'm going to talk about an emerging discipline called MAD studies, which is something that I instruct and teach at university level, and really flesh out what that means for us in our community. So firstly, I'd just like to make a brief note about lived experience, or as I call, living experience, as I'm certainly not dead, and I'm hoping that you aren't either watching this. So lived experience is a contentious word, and many people that have been service users of the mental health system also find it contentious. Some of us identify as survivors and psychiatric survivors, particularly those that have been on the very harsh end of human rights violations and injustices, and have experienced a lot of trauma as a result of the system, and we call that iatrogenic trauma. Along with that, we have people, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, that identify with the word consumer rather than survivor. We also have people that prefer the umbrella term of lived experience that encompasses both the consumer or the personal lived experience, but also the family carer lived experience. So the experiences of what it's like supporting someone, partnering with someone in distress. And I will refer to mental health as emotional distress, as it really demedicalizes and depathologizes the language that we've come to know through biomedicine and the psych sciences, which really construct distress as an illness. And that's something that I work very hard to undo through my own advocacy from that lived experience perspective. So broadly speaking, when I refer to lived experience, I'm referring to anyone where their emotional distress or emotional health has had an impact so significant on their lives that it's really disrupted their ability to live a life of connection, meaning, hope, and purpose. And I base a lot of that on recovery as a concept. So I guess I've mentioned that I'm involved in a few global sort of institutes and organisations around advocacy. So I might speak a little bit to the advocacy and activism that's really been founded within the rights movement. And I think a lot of that comes from service users, particularly that were institutionalised back in the 60s and 70s, where we saw the slow emergence of deinstitutionalisation. You know, we saw asylums, large-scale psychiatric institutions that were very poorly run, poorly funded. People were exposed to treatments beyond their consent and will. And a lot of the service users in that environment really rose and started creating their own liberation groups and collectives, such as the Patient Liberation Group in Canada. So from there and the other civil rights concurrent movements, you know, in women's spaces, in queer spaces, we really saw this evolution of the consumer or MAD or survivor movement during this wave of, I guess, rebellion against the injustices of the state. Through that, we saw, you know, the introduction of political and economic ideology reflecting individualism and neoliberalism. And that really put a hold on any sort of collective movement, as it was seen that most issues were located in the individual and it was their responsibility to resolve that. So unfortunately for a good, 20 or so years, and we still see the significant remnants of neoliberalism, even though we're kind of going through a new movement at the moment. But at the moment, we're in a strange place in mental health where we have a lot of research and science that suggests that actually a lot of our distress, no matter the disorder, is located in trauma, which means that it's actually psychological and socially based. By socially, I mean that the impact of distress could be from lots of different social conditions, such as homelessness, poverty, violence, trauma, sexism, homophobia, racism, ableism, saneism. I could go on and on. And really, I advocate for those as being the true, authentic diagnosis for a lot of people that experience the diagnosis as a result of the DSM or the ICD, which are very, again, medically driven and unfounded in many ways. We actually have very little research and scientific evidence base to suggest what the genealogy or etiology of these conditions actually is. But we do know that we're moving further and further away from the genetic basis of mental distress and locating that, as I said, in a psychological, experiences of trauma and complex grief, and attachment, and then the social, which I referred to before. So that's where I fit in, and I'm a trained social worker, so I've sort of been trained as an expert in social expertise. So a lot of my foundation in lived experience advocacy and activism does come from a social work or critical social work foundation, and I see the lived experience discipline, in some ways similar to social work, but in many ways very different to social work, like all the other mental health disciplines, psychiatry, psychology, psychiatric nursing, and occupational therapy, has become very co-opted by a biomedical model. And the lived experience discipline really moves away from that and really constructs interventions and systems around people that have been deemed mad themselves, but also around the environment, and the focus being on rights and justice, those sorts of intersections. So through the lived experience movement, and lived experience has many different theoretical and research foundations, whether it's looking at medical anthropology, cultural studies, indigenous studies, epistemic injustice, the injustice of how knowledge is constructed and how much it's valued and empowered. So, we value biomedicine up the top a lot more than, say, psychology, and then even lower sociology, and then even lower lived experience. So there's this privilege, this hierarchy and spectrum of knowledge, which lived experience really seeks to deconstruct. So it's very powerful, and that it really undoes what we know and see and understand as science and knowledge, and that we're all co-creators of that knowledge, and that there's different types of science that's not all necessarily quantified, which is an important point to make. So through these experiences of the lived experience movement, or MAD and survivor movement, or ex-patient is another label that people identify with, we've seen the emergence of MAD studies. And by MAD, I mean that people that have been deemed mad by psychiatry or by the system have really revolted and constructed their own discipline of knowledge, their own discipline of theory, and how that's been implemented as in practice and as an intervention and as a social movement as well. So MAD studies really looks at the critique of mental health. It really looks at critical mental health and undoes a lot of those social and structural determinants, the social determinants I mentioned before around employment and housing, education, stigma and discrimination, and looking at those structural determinants as well, those broader determinants that define the political landscape, the economic landscape, some of the ideology, some of the way that politics and decision making is conducted, and a lot of where funding goes as well. So we do look at those sort of broader structural determinants within the umbrella of social determinants, with the intersection of rights and justice. So through looking at that, the MAD studies academic discipline, which is an indiscipline, meaning that it also festers. The idea is that it's not just an academic discipline. The idea is that it promotes activism on the outside to promote rights and justice. It really looks at alternatives to psychiatry. And what I mean by that is looking at ways of deconstructing what we know in mental health, which has been constructed through a biomedical model of illness and pathology, medication, institutionalization, rights violations under the umbrella of supported decision making, and really looks at ways of mad people constructing their own ways of seeing themselves through distress, but also our own interventions, such as the Hearing Voices group, or emotional CPR, or intentional peer support, or peer respite houses. These are all interventions that really fall under the umbrella of MAD studies, of people that have been deemed mad, that have actually constructed their own research and theory for and by people that have been deemed mad. Now, a lot of people also might not identify with that label, which is completely okay. But the intention of using the word mad is very deliberate, in that it's been used as a derogatory term, much like queer in the past has been reclaimed. So it's people really reclaiming madness as part of their unique identity, their sense of selves. And I guess another point I want to launch into is really around the construction of distress and vulnerability, and how essential that actually is to us as human beings for connection and growth and hope and movement forward. And that vulnerability is actually really central to our core existence, to our core humanity. Without vulnerability, we wouldn't be human. So I think that's an important point to critically reflect on when we think about illness and construction of pathology and diagnosis. As I know for myself, a lot of my identity, my sense of self, my creativity, my connection, some of my warmth, a lot of that's actually constructed around my distress. And I'm someone that lives with, as defined by psychiatry or the DSM, bipolar affective disorder, and within the ICD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of my experiences of trauma have meant that I have a real, not unfounded, but I have a real, almost innate or inherent from the trauma experience of wanting to connect with others and bringing other people together. I'm also quite creative, and a lot of that has come from those experiences of being put in fight, flight, freeze constantly through various cumulative traumas, and that need to think very solution focused, to be in the moment, to be able to come up with creative ways of escaping a lot of consistent adversity. And we don't often talk about that. We don't often talk about the strengths of that. And they're some of the major limitations of a biomedical understanding of distress, along with the lack of real cultural understanding or spiritual understanding around people's explanations of distress. In a lot of locations around the world, a lot of communities, a lot of countries, a lot of geographical continents and locations really define distress in very different ways. And distress through a biomedical framework is a very white, very Western, very male, very heterosexual, very able-bodied and able-minded way of thinking about distress that hasn't been constructed by people who have experienced that distress or diverse ability through the 20th and 19th century. So it's really important to start deconstructing what we know and what we see and understand as distress through, a colonial and cultural imperialist way of thinking. And there's some of the contentions of the global mental health movement, because global mental health is not a universal phenomena. And it's really important that we deconstruct that and understand that. And if we're going to talk about global mental health, that actually means talking about localized understanding, localized support and intervention that's co-created through participatory models, through people that have experienced it themselves, leading that. So I really just wanted to leave with you on the point of lived experience, your story, being a real superpower, and really using that as, I won't use the word ammunition because I think that also has very negative connotations, but really using that as your way of connecting, your way of being, your way of moving forward in a world that's meaningful to you. Use it for your activism, use it for your passion, use it to challenge the dominant biomedical model that has a lackluster scientific evidence base, to focus on those social and structural determinants, and to focus on those values of human rights, social justice, and other justices such as racial justice, disability justice, sane justice, and start challenging some of the saneism and ableism that goes on in mental health. because a lot of that's actually constructed around the problematization of distress being a disability and being an illness. So thank you very much. Please connect with me on LinkedIn under Matthew Jackman, double T, or on Facebook. I have quite an open public profile, and we'll hopefully connect soon. Bye for now.